He came back to ashes of a life he thought was waiting for him. 2 years in the mountains, 2 years of silence, frostbite, and solitude. Silas Kane had survived things that would kill most men twice over, and the one thought that kept him moving through the worst of it was simple: the cabin will be there. But smoke was rising from his chimney. Strange horses stood in his corral. And when he kicked open his own front door with his rifle up and his jaw locked tight, a woman he had never seen in his life aimed a Winchester straight at his heart. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one's going to take a while. Let's go. The cold that December was the kind that didn't just settle over the land, it crushed it. It pressed down on the pine forest until the branches bent and snapped under the weight of ice. It drove the elk down from the high ridges and pushed even the wolves into nervous, pacing clusters near the timberline. Creek water froze hard enough to walk on by mid-October, and by the time December rolled in off the Rockies like a slow gray wall, most people with any sense had already retreated somewhere with thick walls and enough firewood to last until March. The Wyoming frontier in winter was not a place that forgave weakness. It barely forgave strength. Silas Kane had been moving through it for 3 days straight. He came down out of the high country on foot, leading his pack mule, a bad-tempered gray animal named Cutter, along a trail that had been nearly swallowed by fresh snowfall. His snowshoes left wide, uneven tracks behind him. His beard was so frozen at the edges that it clinked faintly when he turned his head. The temperature at dawn had been somewhere south of 15 below, and it hadn't climbed more than a few degrees since. Every exhaled breath turned to white vapor and was immediately ripped away by the wind coming down off the ridge. He wasn't miserable, exactly. He had stopped being miserable around the 18-month mark, somewhere up in the high basin where the beaver runs were thick and the nearest human being was about 60 miles in any direction. After that, cold was just cold. Wind was just wind. You dealt with it or you died, and Silas Kane had decided a long time ago that dying was a waste of perfectly good stubbornness. He was 34 years old. He stood just over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, in a way that came from actual work and not any particular vanity about it. His face, what you could see of it beneath the frost-rimmed beard and the deep crease of his hat brim, was weathered past the point where age really showed anymore. His eyes were the pale gray-green of river ice. Steady, reading the terrain, moving without urgency but without waste. He was carrying close to 90 pounds between his own pack and what he'd loaded on Cutter. Nearly 2 years' worth of pelts, beaver, mink, fox, a few otter, bundled and tied and wrapped in oilskin. Good work. Honest weight. Enough to settle his debts in Dunmore and still have money left for supplies to last another year if he decided to go back up. He hadn't decided yet, but he figured the cabin was as good a place as any to think on it. He'd built the structure himself in the spring of 1871, before the long trapping seasons pulled him deeper into the mountains. It sat in a wide, sheltered valley at roughly 5,000 feet, tucked against the eastern face of a long ridge that cut the worst of the northwest wind. Good water nearby, good timber. Far enough from Dunmore, the nearest town of any size, 22 miles to the southeast, that nobody came out this way unless they had specific business, which was exactly the point. Silas Kane did not have a complicated relationship with solitude. He preferred it, mostly. People were exhausting in ways that weather and animals never quite managed to be. Weather at least had the decency to behave according to its own logic. He came out of the tree line at the top of the valley slope just before noon. He stopped. He stood very still for a long moment, his hand dropping instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. Smoke was rising from the chimney of his cabin. He stood there and looked at it for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 10 seconds. His brain did what experienced men's brains do in moments like that. It moved through the possibilities quickly and quietly, the way a hand moves through dark water feeling for what might be down there. Could be travelers. Caught by the weather, used the place for shelter. It happened on the frontier. You left a place unlocked and understood that someone in need might pass through. That was just common sense and basic human decency. But travelers didn't leave horses in a man's corral. He could see them now, 3 of them, standing huddled at the far end of the rail fence, with their heads down against the wind. Good-looking animals, not trail-worn or desperate. Healthy, brushed, fed recently if the easy way they stood meant anything. These horses belonged to someone who took care of things. And firewood. There was a stack of it beside the cabin door. A big stack, chest high and several feet wide, cut and split and piled with obvious effort. That wasn't the work of someone sheltering for a night or two. That was the work of someone who intended to stay. Silas stood on the ridge for another full minute, watching. No movement at the cabin window. No one visible outside. The horses were the only sign of life beyond the smoke. But the smoke itself told a story. Steady and even. Not the thin, nervous thread of a fire just getting started, or the thick, billowing choke of green wood thrown on in a hurry. That was the smoke of a well-built fire in a well-tended hearth. Someone had been living here. He felt the anger move through him like a slow, hot current under all that cold, the kind of anger that doesn't make noise because it doesn't need to. Quiet anger, the kind that comes from a man who has very clear ideas about what is his. He unslung the rifle. Thud. Coming down the valley slope, Silas kept to the tree line as long as he could, using the shadows of the pines as cover, even though it meant a longer approach through deeper snow. Old habit. He left Cutter tied to a branch. The mule didn't need instructions, just patience, and Cutter had plenty of the latter as long as nobody disturbed him. He came up on the cabin from the north side, away from the window, and pressed himself against the log wall for a moment. The wood was warm under his glove. Fire had been burning in there for hours, maybe longer. He could hear nothing from inside over the wind. He moved to the corner, checked the corral again. 3 horses, still standing easy, no sign of alarm. Good. That meant whoever was inside hadn't heard him yet. The front door had his own latch on it. A simple wooden bar drop system he'd made himself, designed to be lifted from outside with a thin leather cord that ran through a hole drilled in the door. He found the cord where it always was, looped around a small peg to the right of the frame. His fingers were numb enough that he fumbled with it twice before he got it loose. He took a breath. He lifted the bar, shoved the door hard with his shoulder, and came through fast with the rifle up. The cabin was warm. Shockingly, almost painfully warm compared to the air outside. And for one disorienting half-second, that warmth hit him so hard that his vision swam slightly and his brain tried to stutter. But his hands didn't stutter. His hands had the rifle up, and his eyes were already sweeping the room. He got as far as the center of the main room before he stopped. There was a woman standing by the fireplace. She was tall, taller than he'd have expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected. With dark hair pinned back in a practical braid and wearing a flannel work shirt over heavy canvas trousers. She looked to be somewhere in her mid to late 20s. She was not pretty in a soft way. Her face was too strong for that, jaw too square, eyes too direct. But she was striking in the way that people with absolute self-possession tend to be striking, which is to say in a way that you don't really analyze until later, because in the moment you're too busy noticing that she is completely unafraid. She was holding a Winchester rifle, leveled at his chest. She had not flinched when he came through the door, had not screamed, had not dropped anything, had not taken a single step backward. By the time Silas's eyes locked onto her, she was already in a shooter's stance, feet shoulder-width apart, weight slightly forward, stock against her shoulder like it belonged there. Her finger was on the trigger. The fire crackled. The wind pressed at the walls. For a moment, neither of them said a single word. Then Silas said, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried weight of a man who was genuinely angry, but had long since learned not to let it get ahead of him. "That's my rifle you're pointing at me." The woman's eyes didn't move off his face. Her voice was steady, maybe overly steady, the way voices get when someone is working hard to sound calm. "No, it's mine, bought and paid for. I mean the one on the wall behind you." Silas kept his own rifle up. "The Winchester hanging above the mantel. That's mine. I made that shot bag on the left peg. I carved those shelves. I built every inch of this cabin with my own 2 hands." A beat. "You want to tell me who you are and what you're doing in my home?" Something crossed her face. Not fear exactly, but a tightening, a recalculation. Her eyes moved just briefly, just fractionally, to the things he'd described. The shot bag, the shelves, then back to him. "My name is Eleanor Hart," she said, "and this is my home. I bought it legally. I have the deed." Silas stared at her. "You have the deed," he repeated. In my saddlebag. I can show you. I'd like to see it. I'd like you to lower your rifle first. I'd like you to lower yours first. A pause. At the same time, then, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like a negotiation, delivered with the brisk tone of someone who had made a great many negotiations recently and was tired of the process but understood it was necessary. Silas found himself, against everything reasonable, slightly impressed by it. He lowered his rifle slowly. She lowered hers at the same pace, not quite in perfect unison because neither of them was willing to go first, until both barrels were pointing at the floor. She didn't lower it all the way. Neither did he. The deed, Silas said. She brought it from the saddlebag she'd been using as something between a document case and a safe. A heavy leather bag with a padlock on it, which she opened with a small key on a cord around her neck without ever turning her back to him completely. The document was on proper paper with an official seal. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was listed as the licensed land agent and property registrar for Dunmore County. Silas read it twice. The cabin was described accurately. The land coordinates matched. The deed bore a date from 9 months ago, April of 1874. He'd been in the high basin by then, 8 days' travel from here, trapping spring runs with no idea any of this was happening. "Where'd you buy this?" he asked. "From the land agent in Dunmore, Gerald Pruitt. I paid $740. She said it the way someone says a number they have thought about every single day since spending it. That was everything I had. Silas set the document down on the table he had built. On the surface he had planned smooth himself. In the cabin he had raised from raw timber with his own hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Pruitt," he said finally. The word came out flat and quiet and with a specific kind of weight that suggested Gerald Pruitt was not going to enjoy the next time Silas Kane came to Dunmore. "You know him." "I know of him." Silas set his rifle against the wall, the first time he'd put it fully down since coming through the door, and straightened up and looked at the room. Really looked at it, the work she'd done. The cabin had been in rough shape when he left for the high country in the fall of 1872. He'd been meaning to do repairs before he went, but hadn't gotten to them all. There had been a bad gap in the chinking on the north wall. One of the window shutters had a broken hinge. The roof over the lean-to out back had needed new shakes put on before the first hard winter hit. All of that was done. The chinking was fresh and solid. He could see it, gray and even in the lamplight. The shelves he'd built held organized stores, dried beans, salt, cornmeal, dried meat wrapped in cloth, canned goods that she must have hauled up from somewhere at significant effort and expense. A heavy blanket hung across the far wall, which he realized after a moment was there for additional insulation. Smart thinking in a cabin this size. A small table had been added near the fireplace with a writing surface and an ink pot, neat and deliberate. The whole place was cleaner than it had ever been when he lived in it, which wasn't something he was particularly proud to admit. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 7 months. 7 months. She'd arrived in May then, before the worst of the mountain heat, and early enough to have time to fix things before winter. She'd done all of this alone, apparently, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. He looked at her. She was watching him look at the room, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. Not exactly pride, though it was related to pride. More like the expression of someone waiting to see if what they've done is going to matter, and already prepared for the answer to be no. "Sit down," he said. It came out rougher than he meant it to. "I'll stand." "Fair enough." He pulled out one of the chairs at the table and sat down himself, set his hat on the table, and rubbed his face with both hands. He was exhausted in a way that 3 days of hard mountain travel produced, and the warmth of the cabin was pressing against that exhaustion now, trying to turn it into something heavier. "Tell me everything Pruitt told you." She told him. Dammit. It came out in pieces, the way stories like that do. Not because she was withholding anything, but because when you've spent 7 months alone in a Wyoming wilderness, actively not thinking about something, putting it back into words takes a moment. Pruitt had advertised the property in several eastern newspapers. She'd seen the listing in a Pittsburgh paper in January. Isolated homestead, improved, good water and timber, remote location in the Wyoming Territory, suitable for independent settlement. The price had been low, significantly low. She'd known that even then. but Pruitt's explanation had been smooth and plausible. Previous owner, he'd said, abandoned the property after the winter of 1872, gone back east, signed the land over to the county for unpaid taxes. I should have asked more questions, Eleanor said. She said it without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if she had. Just a clean, accurate assessment of her own choices. But I needed to be somewhere that nobody would think to look. The more remote and the cheaper, the better. Silas noted the phrasing to somebody would think to look, and filed it away. And Pruitt showed you the tax documents? The transfer paperwork? Yes. Everything looked right. I don't know enough about Wyoming land law to have known what to look for. He had official seals. He had signatures. She stopped. I trusted it because I needed to trust it. That was my mistake. It was Pruitt's crime, Silas said. Not your mistake. Something shifted in her face at that. Brief. She covered it quickly. Either way, I paid $740 for someone else's land. And now the person whose land it is has come home. Yes, the words sat between them for a moment, carrying more weight than one syllable should have had. Silas looked at the fire. The snow was building against the shuttered windows with a low, steady hiss. Outside, the wind had picked up again. He could hear it working at the corners of the roof, that particular high note it made when it was hunting for gaps. It found none, he noticed. She'd sealed those too. You can't go anywhere tonight, he said. Not in that. I know. Or tomorrow, probably. Or the day after. He looked at her. That storm came off the northern peaks. Those run 3 days minimum. I know, she said again, and now there was an edge of something in her voice. Not quite anger, not quite despair, but somewhere between them. The sound of a person who has been making very hard calculations and keeps arriving at the same bad number. I've been watching weather up here for 7 months. I know what a 3-day storm sounds like. Then you know we're stuck here. I know. Together. A pause. Unfortunately, she said. He slept in the lean-to that first night, which was cold but manageable with the buffalo robe he had in his pack and the body heat of the mule, and which was his own decision and not one she pushed for. He'd have slept in the main cabin if she'd have had it, but she'd set her bedroll on the floor near the fire in a way that made clear the arrangement, and he didn't argue. The cabin was hers in every practical sense. Whatever legal situation existed, she had earned her space in it. In the morning he came in stamping snow off his boots, and she had coffee on and cornbread cooking on the flat griddle over the fire, and neither of them mentioned the night before or the rifles. You need to reshoe that gray of yours, she said without looking up. Left front. She's favoring it. I noticed last week. I noticed too. He poured coffee. I'll do it when the storm breaks. There's an extra set of shoes in the tack box. He stopped, looked at her. I found them in the lean-to, she said, still focused on the griddle. Assumed they were yours. I didn't use them. He drank the coffee. It was better than anything he'd made in 2 years. He didn't say that. Appreciate it, he said instead. They ate without talking much. Outside, the storm threw itself against the walls with the kind of sustained effort that made you understand, in your bones, why people didn't survive on this frontier without shelter. Inside, the fire did its work and the cornbread was hot and the coffee was strong and the silence between them was not comfortable. Not yet. Not close to that. But it wasn't hostile either. It was just 2 people in a small space, eating, thinking, staying warm. After a while, Eleanor said, You said you've been trapping for 2 years. About that, 2 winters in the high basin. Alone? Alone. She considered this. Did you come back because you were finished, or because you needed to? It was a more perceptive question than he'd expected, and he thought about it honestly rather than deflecting. Both, he said. The work was done. The cabin was waiting. He looked at the walls. Or it was supposed to be. She nodded, poured more coffee, for both of them, without asking, the way people do when they've been alone long enough that small courtesies become automatic. I need to ask you something. Ask? What are you going to do? About the cabin? He looked at her directly. I'm going to get my land back. Through the law, if the law will cooperate. Around the law, if it won't. And me. You didn't steal anything. Pruitt stole from you same as he stole from me. He set his cup down. But I'm not going to pretend the situation isn't what it is. This is my land, my cabin. I know that. Her voice was level. I've known it since you read the deed and I saw your face. She looked at the fire. I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm asking what your plan is, because whatever it is, it affects me. Silas leaned back in his chair. Outside, the storm screamed. For the winter, he said slowly, we survive. We can't do anything about Pruitt until the roads are open anyway. In the spring, we ride to Dunmore together. We find out exactly what he did, who helped him, and who else he's done it to. We take everything we can find and we burn him down with it. Eleanor's jaw worked slightly. Then she said, and in the meantime, Silas said, we figure out how to share a cabin without killing each other. Well, it was harder than it sounded, and it was also, in small and grudging ways, somewhat easier than either of them expected. Silas knew things she didn't, not about the cabin itself. She'd figured that out thoroughly on her own, but about the land around it. The routes through the valley, the places where the snow packed soft and dangerous on certain slopes, which draws produced game and which were dead territory in winter. The small details of survival in that specific country that you could only accumulate by having spent years learning them the hard way. Eleanor knew things he didn't. She knew how to make the supplies last. She had a particular kind of organized practicality about food and resources that he'd never developed. He tended to use things when he had them and figure out the rest later, which worked fine when you were alone and was a disaster as a long-term strategy. She had lists. She had measurements. She knew exactly how many days their current stores would last and under what conditions. You wrote all this down? He asked on the third day, when she showed him the small ledger she kept. How else would I know? He looked at the neat columns. Quantities, dates, estimated use rates, weather notes. I've been trapping professionally for 8 years and I never thought to do this. That's not a compliment I'm going to accept, she said dryly. That's just a description of poor planning. He found himself wanting to argue and finding that he couldn't. They developed routines the way people do when thrown together by circumstances neither of them chose. Not warmly, not quickly, but practically. Because practicality was the only language the frontier really respected. He handled the animals and the firewood and the exterior work. She handled the interior stores and the cooking, not because those were assigned roles, but because those were the areas each of them had already been managing and changing. The arrangement would have required a conversation neither of them was ready for. What they talked about instead, in the evenings when the fire was down to coals and the dark outside was the absolute dark of wilderness winter, was Pruitt. It started on the 4th night, when Eleanor quietly brought out the envelope she'd been keeping in her saddlebag alongside the deed. She spread its contents on the table between them. The original purchase agreement, 3 letters she'd received from Pruitt before traveling west, and a copy of what he had claimed was the original tax abandonment notice. Silas studied them for a long time. This signature, he said finally, pointing to the bottom of the abandonment notice. This is supposed to be the county registrar. That's what Pruitt said. The county registrar in 1873 was a man named August Fenner. He tapped the signature. I know Fenner's handwriting. He witnessed the original deed when I filed it. This is not his handwriting. Eleanor was very still. You're certain? Certain enough. He straightened. And this seal. See here, the impression is off. The real county seal has a slight crack on the lower left from when it was dropped in 1870. Somebody told me that once. This seal is clean. A forged seal, she said quietly, on a forged abandonment notice. She stopped. Then, which means Pruitt didn't just sell abandoned property. He fabricated the abandonment. He manufactured evidence that you'd given up the land, then sold it. Yes. That's not just fraud. That's a felony in the Wyoming territory, Silas said. And Pruitt didn't do this alone. You need at least 2 people to forge a county seal and produce documents with it. Someone in the county office or someone with access to it. He looked at her. Did Pruitt ever mention anyone else? A partner? A colleague? Eleanor thought. The fire popped. He mentioned a name once, when I was finalizing the purchase. He said something about having to clear it with Harlan before the paperwork could be finalized. She paused. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was a business partner. Harlan. Do you know that name? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, Martin Harlan. He's the president of the Dunmore Cattlemen's Bank. Eleanor stared at him. A banker, she said. The banker, in that county. He controls most of the large land notes in the valley. He's been pushing for consolidation of smaller properties for years, buying up homesteads when people go under, rolling them into larger parcels that he controls. Silas's voice had gone very flat and quiet. If Pruitt sold my land, Harlan financed it. And if Harlan financed it, there's a trail of paperwork somewhere that ties them together. Eleanor reached over slowly and began folding her documents back into the envelope. So it's not just Pruitt, she said. No. We're looking at a banker with connections, money, influence over the county government. Yes. She tucked the envelope away. Her hands were completely steady. That's going to be considerably more dangerous than suing a crooked land agent. Yes, Silas said again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him across the table, and her expression had settled into something clear and deliberate. Not hard exactly, but resolved. The expression of someone who has already been through enough that the size of a problem has stopped being a reason not to face it. Spring, she said. Spring. December turned. The storm that had locked them into the valley for its promised 3 days wound up lasting 5, and then another smaller system came down from the north and added 2 more, and by the time January arrived with its brief, illusory periods of cold, calm sunlight, Silas and Eleanor had settled into something that wasn't quite comfort, but was starting to resemble a functioning life. He was surprised by her, regularly, and in ways he didn't particularly welcome. He'd formed a picture of her in the first hours. Eastern woman, runaway, probably soft despite everything, holding things together through sheer stubbornness but liable to crack if pressed. And she systematically dismantled that picture piece by piece without apparently trying to. She could shoot, not the hesitant half-knowledge of someone who'd been handed a weapon for protection and told to point it. She knew what she was doing. The form she'd had when she leveled the Winchester at him that first day wasn't panic form, it was trained form. And when he watched her one afternoon through the lean-to window as she put 3 rounds into the post she'd set up at 40 yards, all 3 hitting within a hand's width of center, he revised several assumptions at once. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" he asked that evening. "My father was a good shot," she said, and her voice had a particular emptiness in it that meant the subject was closed, and he didn't push it. She could work. Not just the keeping the cabin running kind of work that she'd already demonstrated, but the heavy outdoor work. She helped him clear the snow load from the lean-to roof when it built up dangerously in late January, hauling timber and working a shovel for 3 hours in the kind of cold that made breathing hurt. And when they were done, she went inside and made supper without complaining once. He caught himself watching her sometimes, not with any particular feeling he could have named cleanly, but with a kind of recalibration happening somewhere behind his eyes, adjusting what he thought he knew. She was perceptive in ways that sometimes caught him off guard. "You don't sleep much," she said one morning, a statement rather than a question. "Sleep enough." "You were up at 2. I heard you go out. Heard something on the north slope. Turned out to be elk." She poured coffee, handed him a cup. "You check the perimeter every night." He didn't answer. "I do too," she said. "Different directions. I've been doing it since July." She sat down. "Who are you expecting?" He looked at her. She looked back, and the question was genuine. Not worried, not dramatic. Just a person who had taken every precaution she knew to take and was curious whether the person sharing her space was working from the same information or different. "People Pruitt and Harlan might send," he said, "if they know I'm back." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "There's something else you should know," she said, "about why I came here, why I needed somewhere nobody would find me." He waited. "My husband," she said. And then she stopped and seemed to be choosing words very carefully, the way you do when a story is complicated and ugly and you've told it to yourself so many times that the telling has worn grooves in you. "My former husband. We haven't been married in any real sense for 3 years, but in the eyes of Pennsylvania law, we still are. His name is Aldrich Hart." She looked at the table. "He is a very wealthy man, powerful family, state legislature connections." A pause. "And he is the reason I left with everything I had and came somewhere that doesn't appear in any newspaper or conversation connected to my name." Silas said nothing. He was listening in the way that he listened. completely, without interruption, without filling the spaces. He is not a man who accepts that someone belonging to him can simply leave, Eleanor said. The word belonging came out with a specific bitterness, worn smooth by repetition. I made plans for 2 years, saved money secretly, made arrangements. She stopped. I was careful. I thought I was careful enough. But you're still watching over your shoulder, Silas said. Every day since I left Philadelphia. She looked at him directly. You should know that, about who you're sharing this winter with, what it might bring to your door. Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the January wind moved through the pines with a sound like low water. What I know, he said slowly, is that a woman ran from a bad situation, got cheated by a criminal land agent, and has been living alone in a Wyoming wilderness for 7 months, fixing everything that was broken and not asking anyone for help. He looked at her. The past that chases a person doesn't say much about who that person is. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, back at the table, and he saw the muscles in her jaw work once, quickly, the way they do when you're holding something down. I appreciate that, she said quietly. That. February arrived with the cold so deep and still that it had its own kind of beauty, the way dangerous things sometimes do. The sky was often that blue-white color that looks painted on, too vivid to be entirely real, and the snow on the valley floor was crusted hard enough by morning that you could walk on top of it before the midday thaw turned the surface to soft treachery. Silas had been working the trap lines, short runs close to the valley, nothing that took him more than a few hours from the cabin, partly because of weather, partly because of the other thing, the thing he hadn't said out loud but had been thinking about since Eleanor's conversation about her husband. He was checking the second line of sets, a shallow run through the aspen thicket to the northwest, when he found the track. He crouched in the snow and looked at it for a long moment. Human. Snowshoe. Larger frame than Eleanor's, though he knew her tracks by now, the slightly inward angle of her right foot from an old injury she'd never mentioned. These were different. Bigger stride. A man, almost certainly. Coming from the northwest and turning south toward the valley. Coming from the direction of the Rimrock Pass. In February, which meant whoever had made this track had either come through the pass before it closed in January, so unlikely given the track's freshness, or had come over the mountain by a route that nobody used in winter unless they had a very specific reason to be here that couldn't wait for spring. Silas followed the track for 20 minutes until it intersected with a second set. 2 men, both turning toward the cabin's valley. He went back fast. She was splitting kindling when he came through the tree line at a near run, and she read his face immediately. Not panic in it, nothing close to panic, but the flat, controlled urgency of a man who has found something he didn't want to find. What? She said. 2 men, northwest, snowshoes, probably half a day ahead of me when they made those tracks, which puts them tonight, she said, or close to it. She didn't ask how he knew or what it meant. She set the axe down and straightened up and said, "Where do we position?" He looked at her. She was looking back at him steadily, and the question was completely practical. Where do we position? Not who are they or what do we do, but the question of someone who has already accepted the situation and is moving to the next step. We don't know what they want yet, he said. Could be Pruitt's people. Could be his, she said quietly. Not frightened, just naming it. Yes, then it doesn't matter which, either way. He thought about arguing with that assessment and decided it was accurate. I want you inside, shutters barred. I'll take them. No, she said. We've talked about this. I'm not hiding. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be inside where there's cover, which I can have, and also hold a rifle from the east window. She picked up the axe again, not to use it, just to have something in her hands, he thought. I know this land now too, Silas. I've walked every inch of this valley. If they come from the northwest, the best approach is through the aspen draw. She pointed, which means they come out there, into the open, with the firelight from the window showing them to anyone watching from inside. He stared at her. She was right. East window, he said finally. East window, she agreed, and you take the ridge. They ate early, cleared the table, and moved through their preparations with a quiet efficiency that neither of them commented on. It was the efficiency of two people who had spent weeks now reading each other's movements, who had developed the shared spatial awareness of individuals living in close quarters, knowing where the other person was, what they were doing, when to step aside. Eleanor loaded the Winchester and laid out additional ammunition on the shelf below the east window, within easy reach in the dark. She shuttered the windows except for the east one, which she left open a calculated inch. Enough to see through, not enough to let in anything that shouldn't come in. She moved the lamp so that it cast light toward the front of the cabin and away from her position. Silas watched all of this from the doorway for a moment before going out. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "If it goes bad—" "It won't," she said. "If it does." She held his gaze. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." A pause. "Go." He went. The two men came into the valley at roughly 9 in the evening, crossing the open snow from the northwest draw just as Eleanor had predicted, moving in the way that men move when they think they're being careful, but are cold enough that careful has gotten sloppy. Silas let them come to within 50 yards of the cabin before he spoke from the darkness of the ridge above them. "Stop there." They stopped. One of them grabbed for something at his hip and then seemed to reconsider. "We don't want any trouble," the closer one called up. His voice had the flat, nasal quality of somewhere in the middle of the country. Not frontier men, not mountain men. Hired men. "What do you want then?" A pause. "We're looking for a woman. Name of Hart. We have papers." "You're on private land," Silas said. "You have no authority here." "The papers give us authority. They give you nothing in Wyoming territory. Whatever you were told about jurisdiction, you were lied to." A silence. The wind moved through the aspen trees. "You've got about 3 minutes to tell me who sent you and what you were told before I decide you're trespassing with hostile intent." Another pause. The two men exchanged a look that Silas could see clearly from the ridge, the brief calculating look of hired workers assessing whether the job was worth the immediate situation. The one who hadn't spoken yet turned and walked back toward the aspen draw without a word. The first one hesitated. Then he called up, "Harlan, Martin. Harlan hired us to find out if you'd come back. We ain't here for the woman, whatever you heard." A pause. "The woman's somebody else's problem. Harlan just wants to know if you're back." "Now you know I'm back," Silas said. "Tell him I said hello." The man walked away fast. Set. After they were gone, after Silas had tracked their retreat far enough into the northwest pass to be sure they were actually leaving, he came back to the cabin and came through the door and found Eleanor standing at the east window with the Winchester still in her hands and her shoulders carrying the particular rigid set of someone who has been holding everything very still for a long time. She turned when she heard him. Her face was controlled and steady, and he could see just barely in the lamplight the effort that steadiness was costing her. "What did they want?" she said. "Harlan sent them, checking if I'd come back." Not him, not Aldrich. Not this time. She absorbed this. Then she set the Winchester down on the shelf and turned fully toward the fire, presenting her back to him in a way that said clearly she needed a moment. He gave it to her. He hung his coat and hat and sat down at the table and waited. After a while she said, without turning around, "It's only a matter of time. Probably. Spring won't be safe, not if Harlan knows you're here. Not if—" "No," he said. "Spring won't be safe." He looked at the fire. "But neither is waiting." She turned around finally. Her face had settled into something clear and quiet and decided. Not resigned. Nothing like resigned. The opposite of resigned. "Then we don't wait," she said. Silas looked at her across the small, warm space of the cabin he had built, in the valley he had come home to find changed in every way, and strangely, unexpectedly, changed for the better. In some ways he still wasn't ready to examine. "No," he said. "We don't wait." Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed its full weight against the walls, and inside, the fire held. The two men from Harlan didn't come back. That didn't mean much, and both Silas and Eleanor understood that without saying it. Men like Martin Harlan didn't send scouts because they were curious. They sent scouts because they were building a picture, calculating angles, deciding what a thing was worth before they committed to a course of action. The two men in the snow had been the question. Whatever came next would be the answer. February finished itself out in the way Wyoming Februaries do. Slowly, grudgingly, with occasional days of false warmth that made you believe for a few hours that the worst was past, followed by nights that reminded you exactly how wrong you were. The cold eased a few degrees but never broke. The snowpack in the high valley stayed deep and crusted. The pass to the northwest stayed closed. Silas and Eleanor worked. That was the thing about frontier winter. It didn't leave room for much else. The daily business of staying alive and keeping the homestead functional consumed hours in a way that townspeople never quite understood. Firewood had to be hauled and split and stacked. Animals had to be fed, watered, and checked for the dozen small injuries and ailments that cold produced. The cabin's exterior needed constant monitoring. Ice building under the eaves could work under the shakes and split them, which meant a leak midwinter, which in that cold meant real trouble. The trap lines needed running even in bad weather because a frozen dead animal in a trap was a wasted pelt and a sprung set that would need to be reset anyway. They divided the work without ceremony. It had evolved over the weeks into something functional, and Silas would have admitted, if pressed, more efficient than what he'd managed alone. He was good at the solitary, physical, exterior work, the hauling and trapping and trail breaking. She was good at the longer horizon thinking, the resource management, the things that required tracking systems instead of instinct. Neither of them was good at everything, and both of them were aware of it, and they had arrived, without discussion, without any kind of formal arrangement, at the understanding that the gap between what each of them was good at was roughly the shape of the other person. He didn't dwell on that. It was a practical observation, not a sentimental one. What he did dwell on, in the evenings when the work was done and the fire was settling and Eleanor sat at her small table with her ledger or her letters, was the Pruitt problem. More specifically, the Harlan problem. Because the more Silas turned it over in his mind, the more certain he became that what had happened to his land wasn't an isolated act of opportunism. It was a pattern. "Tell me again what Pruitt said about the property when he sold it to you," he said one evening in the second week of February. Eleanor looked up from the letter she was writing. She wrote letters regularly, folded them and dated them, and kept them in the saddlebag, though she'd had no way to send them since October. He'd never asked who they were to. Which part? The part about the previous owner. He said the owner had gone back east, gave up the property after the winter of 1872. Couldn't handle frontier conditions. He said couldn't handle frontier conditions. Words to that effect. Silas nodded slowly. He'd been thinking about Roy Kastner. Roy had been a homesteader about 12 miles north, in a narrower valley up along the Whetstone Creek drainage. Silas had known him vaguely. They'd crossed paths a few times in Dunmore, shared a drink once, exchanged the kind of easy, intermittent conversation that frontier neighbors had when they happened to be in the same place at the same time. Roy had been a solid man, not dramatic about hardship, not a complainer. He'd built a decent operation up along the Whetstone, had water and timber and good ground for a kitchen garden once the soil was worked. Roy hadn't been in Dunmore the last time Silas came through, in the fall of 1872, before heading up to the high basin. He'd assumed Roy was just busy. There was another homesteader, Silas said, north of here, man named Kastner, good land, good setup. Last I knew of him, he was doing fine. He looked at the fire. I want to find out what happened to his property. Eleanor's pen stopped moving. You think Pruitt sold his land too? I think a man with a forged county seal and a banker backing him didn't do all that work for one transaction. He looked at her. I think we're going to find out there are others, maybe several others. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through it. The same methodical way she worked through the supply ledger, following a chain of logic to its end. If there are multiple fraudulent sales, she said carefully, then it's not just a crime against you or against me. It's an organized scheme, systematic theft of frontier land. Yes? That changes what kind of evidence we need. Yes? She set her pen down and turned fully to face him. Her expression had the focused quality it got when she was thinking seriously about something. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a stillness in the rest of her face, like everything not needed for thinking had been temporarily switched off. If we go to Dunmore with just our two cases, Harlan's lawyers bury it. He's got money, connections, probably half the county officials in his pocket already. Two people against that doesn't win. She paused. But if we go with a pattern, documented cases, names, dates, forged documents from multiple transactions, that's harder to suppress. That's something a territorial judge can't ignore. Silas looked at her. You've thought about law. I've thought about how powerful men avoid consequences, she said, with a flatness that suggested the education had been personal. Which is the same thing, mostly. He almost asked about Aldrich Hart right then. Almost. But the fire settled, and she picked her pen back up, and the moment passed, and he decided it wasn't yet. Instead, he said, There's a woman in Dunmore, Mabel Suarez. She keeps a boarding house, been there 20 years, knows everyone and everything that passes through that town. If Pruitt sold other properties, she'll know about it, or she'll know who does. How do you know her? She fixed a broken rib for me in the winter of 1869 and didn't charge me more than the cost of the bandaging. He paused. She also gave me a significant lecture about climbing unstable rock formations in January, which I have not entirely taken to heart, but which I do think about. Eleanor's mouth pulled slightly at one corner, such not quite a smile, not yet, but in the neighborhood of one. It was the closest thing to humor she'd offered in his direction since the first day, and it was gone almost immediately, but he noticed it. When the pass opens, he said, she's our first stop. When the pass opens. Eleanor nodded and returned to her letter, and the cabin settled back into its quiet working rhythm, the fire burning and the wind working at the corners, and the two of them thinking separately about the same enemy. The pass opened on the 4th of March. It wasn't a dramatic event. No sudden thaw, no great theatrical crack of the ice. It was just that the temperature stayed above freezing for 3 consecutive days, and the north wind dropped enough that the drift blocking the upper end of the pass settled and slumped, and became, on the morning of the 4th, something you could push a horse through if you were willing to take it slow. Silas found out by going up and looking, which was how you found out things on the frontier. 2 days' ride to Dunmore, he said when he came back. Pass is rough, but passable. If we leave tomorrow morning, we can make it before dark the second day. Eleanor was already at the saddlebag. Not packing it, she'd never fully unpacked the important things, which told its own story, but checking it, methodically working through the contents, documents, letters, the small lockbox with what was left of her money. I need to bring everything. I figured. She looked up. There's one thing I want to say before we go. He waited. Whatever we find in Dunmore, however bad it is, however many people Harlan has on his side, I am not going to run from it. She said it clearly, without drama, but with the particular weight of something that had been decided a long time ago and was being stated now as a matter of record. I'm done running. I know that might make things more complicated. It doesn't make them more complicated, Silas said. It makes them more honest. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and went back to the saddlebag. They left at first light. The ride to Dunmore took 2.5 days. Not 2, because the pass was rougher than Silas had hoped, and they lost several hours on the second afternoon to a section of trail that had shifted under the snowmelt and required careful picking through. They didn't talk much on the trail. The terrain demanded attention, and both of them were in the particular focused state that comes before a confrontation when you've had a long time to think about it and have now run out of time. On the second evening, they camped in the lee of a sandstone outcrop about 6 miles east of Dunmore, built a small fire, and ate the last of the cornbread Eleanor had wrapped before they left. Tell me about Harlan, Eleanor said. Everything you know. Silas thought about it. He came to Dunmore about 8 years ago. Before that, somewhere east, I don't know exactly. He had money when he arrived, enough to buy the existing bank operation from the man who'd been running it. Within 2 years, he had notes on most of the significant land in the county. He turned the cornbread over in his hands. He's not stupid. He doesn't make threats directly. He makes loans that create obligations, and then when people can't pay, he has the law on his side. That's how powerful men work, Eleanor said. You sound like you know that kind of man. A pause. The fire moved. My father was that kind of man, she said. Aldrich is that kind of man. She was looking at the fire, not at him. They don't need to hit you. They just build the walls closer and closer until you can't move, and then they tell you you've been free the whole time. A beat. Harlan forging land documents is actually cruder than what I'm used to. He must have gotten impatient. Or greedy, Silas said. Greed makes people sloppy. Yes. She finished her cornbread, brushed the crumbs from her hands. So we use the sloppiness. That's the plan. She looked at him then, and in the firelight she looked tired in a way she rarely let show. Not physically tired, she could outlast most people physically, but the deeper kind. The tired that comes from years of being careful and afraid in a place that should have been safe. Do you think it'll actually work? She said. Honestly, Silas considered the question as seriously as it deserved. I think Harlan has more power than us. I think Pruitt will lie through his teeth. I think getting a county judge to move against the man who controls the county bank is going to require more than just our word. He paused. But I also think Harlan made a mistake when he forged those documents, because documents leave traces, and traces turn into evidence when somebody who knows what to look for goes looking. He looked at her. And I think you're the kind of person who knows what to look for. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You've changed your opinion of me. It wasn't an accusation or a question, just an observation stated plainly in the way she stated most things. Some, he said. From what to what? He thought about lying, considered it genuinely, and decided against it. I thought you were someone who'd gotten herself into something and needed rescuing. I know now that you've been rescuing yourself continuously for years, and what you actually needed was just for someone to stop getting in the way. She looked at the fire for a long moment. That might be the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me, she said quietly. Silas didn't answer. The fire burned. They rode into Dunmore the following afternoon. The town was bigger than it had been when Silas left in the fall of 1872, which he noted without particular feeling. A main street, muddy with snowmelt, running between two rows of frame buildings, general store, feed and tack, a hotel that had been expanded, two saloons, a hardware merchant, and at the east end of the street, the solid stone-fronted building that bore a painted sign reading Dunmore Cattlemen's Bank. M. Harlan, proprietor. Eleanor looked at it as they rode past. Said nothing. Mabel Suarez's boarding house was on the north edge of town, a wide two-story structure that had been built with the kind of practical permanence that said its owner intended to stay. The porch had been swept clean of the last of the snow. A lamp burned in the front window even in the afternoon. Mabel herself opened the door before they'd finished tying the horses, which meant she'd heard them coming from half a block away and had been watching. She was 60 or close to it, a compact Portuguese-American woman with gray-streaked black hair and the kind of steady, evaluating eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Silas, then at Eleanor, then back at Silas. You've been gone a long time, she said. 2 years. I know how long it's been. She stepped back from the door. Come in, both of you. I'll put coffee on, and then you're going to tell me what's happened because I have some ideas already, and I want to know if I'm right. Inside the boarding house kitchen, over a table Mabel kept so clean it almost seemed impolite to put things on it, the story came out. Silas laid out the deed situation and the forged documents. Eleanor produced the purchase agreement and the letters from Pruitt. Mabel listened to all of it without interrupting, which was notable because she was not typically a woman who let other people talk uninterrupted. When they finished, she sat back in her chair and folded her hands on the table and said, Roy Kastner. Silas straightened. What about him? His land was sold last June. Pruitt handled it. Said Roy had gone back to Missouri. Family trouble. Abandoned the property. Sold it to a cattle operation out of Cheyenne for about half what it was worth. Mabel's voice was steady and hard. I didn't believe it then, because Roy Kastner told me not 3 weeks before that he was putting in a second well and wasn't going anywhere, but I had no proof of anything. Do you know where Roy went? Eleanor said. No. And that worries me more than the rest of it. Mabel looked at her. You're the woman who bought Silas's property. I am. You paid Pruitt directly? In his office. He had a clerk witness the transaction. Mabel's expression tightened. The clerk would be his nephew, Daniel. 20 years old, does whatever Gerald tells him. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I know 3 other families who've sold land through Pruitt in the last 2 years. 2 of them I'm fairly certain were pressured into it. Harlan holds notes on both properties, and when the loan terms changed suddenly, selling was the only option. She paused. One of them, the Abernethy family, told me the process was so fast and the paperwork so voluminous that they couldn't follow it all. She said it felt like signing things she didn't quite understand. That's deliberate. Eleanor said immediately. Volume of paperwork is a strategy. You bury the irregular documents in the middle of the legitimate ones and rush the signing. Both Silas and Mabel looked at her. I've seen it done, Eleanor said flatly and didn't elaborate. What do we actually have? Silas said. Not what we think, what we can prove. Eleanor spread the documents on the table. I have my purchase agreement, which contains the forged abandonment notice. The forgery is in the county seal, and you said the signature. If we can get a comparison document, something with Fenner's actual signature from around the same period, the forgery can be demonstrated. The county records office would have those, Mabel said. The ledgers from 1872 and 1873 should show every transaction Fenner witnessed. Assuming they haven't been altered, Silas said. Mabel gave him a look. Hugh Fenner is August's son. He took over the records office when his father retired. Hugh Fenner is possibly the most boring and meticulous man in the Wyoming Territory, which in this situation is exactly what you want. He keeps every record his father kept in the original with his own copies. If anyone has touched those ledgers, Hugh will know. She paused. He also has no particular affection for Harlan. Harlan tried to acquire the building the records office occupies 2 years ago. Hugh filed 17 separate legal objections. 17, Silas repeated. He is very meticulous. Eleanor was making notes in her ledger, fast and precise. We need Fenner. We need to know about Roy Kastner. We need to talk to the Abernethy family. She looked up. And we need to move carefully, because the moment Harlan knows what we're doing, he already knows you're in town, Mabel said quietly. Or he will within the hour. This is a small place. The kitchen went quiet for a moment, just the sound of the fire in the stove and the distant noise of the street outside. Then we move tonight, Silas said. Mabel nodded. Hugh Fenner lives above the records office. He's there by 7 every evening. She stood up, began clearing cups without fuss. You can both stay here. I have rooms. She paused with her back to them. Silas, I need to tell you something. Her tone had changed. He noticed it. Go ahead. She turned around. Her face had the expression of someone delivering news they've been holding for a while, waiting for the right moment and finding that the right moment has arrived, ready or not. 2 weeks ago, a man came through here, came in on the Cheyenne stage, didn't stay at my place, went to the hotel. He was asking questions about a woman traveling alone, said he was a private inquiry agent. She looked at Eleanor. He had a description, dark hair, tall, Eastern accent, traveling under the name Hart. Eleanor's hand on the table was perfectly still. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Mabel held her gaze. That was 2 weeks ago. I don't know if he's still in the territory or if he went back to report. Eleanor's jaw worked once. Then she said, Thank you for that. He showed me a photograph, Mabel said carefully. Formal portrait. Wedding photograph, I'd guess, from the look of it. She paused. The man in the photograph was well-dressed, older than you by a good stretch. He was smiling in the photograph, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach. I know the smile, Eleanor said. Silence. Silas looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the table, and every muscle in her face and neck was controlled and exact, and he recognized the look. It was the same look she'd had the first night, when she'd held the Winchester on him, when she'd decided not to be afraid even though she was. The decision wearing the face of calm. It doesn't change anything, she said, and she was talking to herself as much as to them. It doesn't change what we're doing here. Silas said, If he's still in the territory, then he's still in the territory, she said. Her voice was even. And I'll deal with that when it becomes something to deal with. Right now we have Harlan and Pruitt, and we have one evening before they know we're here and start making their own arrangements. She looked up from the table, and her eyes were clear. Which problem do you want to work on first? Silas held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up and reached for his coat. Fenner, he said, let's go see the most meticulous man in Wyoming. They left Mabel's at 6:30, in the blue-gray dusk of an early March evening, moving through streets that were quiet but not empty. A few men outside the saloon who watched them pass without comment. A woman hurrying home with a wrapped bundle. The lamp in the bank window still burning, which meant someone was inside, working late or waiting. Silas didn't look at the bank directly, but he knew Eleanor did. The records office was a narrow frame building sandwiched between the hardware merchant and what had been a lawyer's office until the lawyer in question had departed for Colorado with some urgency the previous year. A light burned in the upper window. Silas knocked on the street-level door. The man who answered was younger than Silas had expected, mid-30s, spare and slight, with the posture of someone who spent a great deal of time bent over a desk and had developed a permanent slight forward lean as a result. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and had ink on 3 fingers of his right hand. He looked at Silas. His eyebrows went up. Silas Kane. Hugh, I heard you were back. Hugh Fenner's eyes moved to Eleanor, back to Silas, then to the envelope Eleanor was carrying. Something shifted in his expression. The slight forward lean increased, as if a problem he'd been circling from a distance had just stepped into range. You'd better come up. The upper room was exactly what Mabel had promised. Meticulous. Shelves of ledgers, each labeled in small, precise handwriting. A large work table with a single lamp positioned to illuminate the center. Maps on the walls, heavily annotated. Papers in organized stacks that somehow conveyed the impression that every item knew where it belonged and was content to stay there. Hugh Fenner looked at the documents Eleanor spread on his work table and said nothing for several minutes. He moved a magnifying glass over the county seal on the abandonment notice. He went to a shelf without hesitation, pulled a ledger from 1872, and opened it to a page with the smooth efficiency of someone who has handled these materials so many times that they've become extensions of his hands. He set the ledger next to Eleanor's document and studied both through the magnifying glass. Then he straightened up and took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "The seal is wrong," he said. "The signature is wrong." He paused. "I have original documentation in this office dated April 1872, witnessed and signed by my father, showing Silas Kane as the lawful owner of record for this property, with no subsequent transfer, no tax default, no abandonment." He looked at Silas. "None. There is no legal basis for any transaction involving your land. Pruitt had no property to sell." The room was very quiet. "How many?" Silas said. Fenner looked at him steadily. "In the past 26 months, I have identified discrepancies in 7 transactions handled through Pruitt's office. I have been documenting them." He went to a different shelf, pulled a different ledger, this one newer, the ink darker. "I did not know what to do with what I found. I still don't know what to do with it. Harlan controls the circuit judge's schedule. The county sheriff is not compromised exactly, but cautious in ways that amount to the same thing." He set the ledger on the table beside the others. "But I have been keeping records, because that is what I do." Eleanor put her hand flat on the open ledger. Her fingers were trembling, very slightly, for the first time that Silas had seen. 7 properties, she said. 7 documented, possibly more that I haven't found discrepancies in yet. Fenner looked at her carefully. "You purchased one of them." "Yes." "Your money is gone." "Yes." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Eleanor took a breath. "Will you testify?" she said. "In front of a territorial judge. If we can get one here who isn't in Harlan's pocket, will you put all of this in front of them?" Hugh Fenner looked at the shelves around him, at the 20 years of records his father had kept and that he was keeping, at the one room in Dunmore where the truth was documented precisely and stored carefully and had been waiting, apparently, for someone to come use it. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question," he said. Outside, down the dark main street of Dunmore, the lamp in the bank window finally went out. Hugh Fenner made copies of everything that night. He worked by lamplight until well past midnight, his pen moving with the methodical precision of a man who understood that what he was producing might matter in a court of law, and therefore could not afford a single careless stroke. Silas sat in the corner and watched the street through the narrow window. Eleanor sat across from Fenner at the work table and organized the documents as he finished them. Original on one side, copy on the other, everything dated and initialed in the margin. Nobody talked much. There was a particular quality to the silence in that room, the weight of 7 stolen properties and the names attached to them sitting on the table between 3 people who were now committed, whether they'd said so plainly or not, to doing something about it. Around 11, Fenner looked up from his copying and said without preamble, "Roy Kastner didn't go back to Missouri." Silas looked at him. "I received a letter from a cousin of Roy's in November. She was trying to locate him. She'd had no word since the spring. Fenner set his pen down carefully. I wrote back and told her what Pruitt claimed. She wrote again and said Roy had no family left in Missouri, parents dead, no siblings, nowhere to go back to. He paused. I don't know what happened to Roy Kastner. I've been trying not to think about the most obvious explanation. The room was very quiet. How old was he? Eleanor asked. 42, 43 by now, if... Fenner stopped, picked up the pen again. He was a good man. Silas turned back to the window. The street below was empty and dark. The hotel across the way had one light still burning on the second floor. He'd been watching that light for an hour, the way it stayed steady and didn't move. Not someone reading or getting ready for sleep, but someone sitting. Waiting, maybe. He didn't say anything about it. They left Fenner's at midnight with 2 sets of copies, one set for Fenner's own files, one set that Eleanor packed into her saddlebag alongside the originals. Fenner had also given them a name, Judge Wallace Pryor, a territorial circuit judge based out of Laramie, who Fenner described as honest, thorough, and specifically not beholden to Harlan because he'd ruled against Harlan's interests twice in land disputes and hadn't apparently lost sleep over it. I'll write to Pryor in the morning, Fenner said at the door, before Harlan knows what I'm doing. He may already know you've spoken to us, Eleanor said. He may. Fenner looked at her steadily through his glasses. But the letter will be on the Laramie stage before Harlan can do anything about it legally. After that, it's out of his hands. A pause. Get out of town tomorrow morning, both of you. Don't give him the opportunity to create a situation here where he controls the terrain. It was good advice, and they took it. Mabel had supper waiting when they got back, late as it was, and she sat with them while they ate and didn't ask questions until Silas told her about Roy Kastner. Then she was quiet for a long time, her hands folded on the table, her face doing the particular work that faces do when information that was feared turns out to be worse than feared. I liked Roy, she said finally. Nobody added anything to that. They left Dunmore at first light, before the town was properly awake, and made the return trip to the cabin in a day and a half of hard riding. Eleanor barely spoke on the trail. Not the hostile silence of the early weeks, something different. She was processing, Silas could tell, turning the information from Fenner's office over and over the way you turn a problem that has too many pieces and not enough answers. It was on the second morning of the ride, with the cabin valley finally visible in the distance below them, that she said it. If they went after Roy Kastner, I know, Silas said. We're not just witnesses to a land fraud. We're threats to people who've already possibly... She stopped. I know, he said again, quieter. She looked straight ahead at the valley. We need to be ready for something worse than 2 men with snowshoes. He didn't argue with that. The cabin was as they'd left it, which was a relief in the straightforward animal way that returning to shelter and finding it intact is always a relief, regardless of what else is happening. They put the horses up, checked the stores, went through the routines. But the routines felt different now, more deliberate, more weighted. Silas checked the exterior of the cabin that evening with a different eye than before. Angles of approach, fields of fire, the timberline and how far it came from the north and west. He'd been a trapper for 8 years. Before that, he'd spent 3 years as a scout for the Army out of Fort Laramie. And before that, he'd grown up in eastern Tennessee in a family that didn't produce men with a lot of illusions about how peacefully the world operated. He knew how to think about terrain as something that could be used or could be used against you, and standing in the cold dusk looking at the valley, he thought about it carefully. The cabin sat with its back to the eastern ridge. Good. Anyone approaching from the east had to come over high ground and would be visible for a long time before they reached the structure. The north and west approaches were more open, with the aspen thicket about 200 yards out providing the closest significant cover. The corral was to the south. The main window faced west, toward the valley floor. He walked the full perimeter twice in the gathering dark, then came back inside. Eleanor was cleaning the Winchester at the table. Not nervously, with the focused attention she gave everything, the barrel laid out on an oiled cloth, the cleaning rod going through with steady strokes. North and west are the problem, he said. I know, the aspens. We need something out there. A tripwire, at minimum, something that makes noise. She set the barrel down. There's wire in the lean-to, Left over from when I fixed the corral fence. She paused. I can set it tomorrow morning. I know those aspens well enough to do it in the dark if I had to. He believed her. Sleep in shifts, he said, starting tonight. Agreed. She picked up the barrel again. Silas? Yeah. She didn't look up from the cleaning. The man in the photograph. Aldrich. She said the name like it was something she'd rather not put in her mouth. He doesn't send inquiry agents when he's just curious. He sends them when he's already made a decision and needs to confirm the location before he acts on it. Silas sat down across from her. You think he's coming himself? No. Aldrich doesn't travel to uncomfortable places. He hires men who do. She paused. But the men he hires are not the kind of men who come to talk. He's not trying to persuade me to come back at this point. Something moved through her voice. Not fear, but the particular flatness that comes after fear has been lived with long enough to become something more like fact. He has too much pride for persuasion. What does he want? He wants to make sure I don't come back. Her hand stilled on the rifle. And that I don't talk about why I left. The fire crackled. Silas looked at her for a moment. At the careful way she was holding herself together, the cost of it visible in the set of her shoulders. He thought about asking the full question. What happened? What did you see or know that made you worth silencing? And decided it wasn't the moment. Maybe there would be a moment later. Maybe not. Anyone who comes onto this property with hostile intent, he said, is going to have a bad night regardless of who sent them. She looked up then, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but a lessening of a particular kind of weight. The weight of being the only person in the room who understands the size of a problem. I appreciate that, she said. I know you do. She went back to the cleaning, and he went back to his own preparations. And outside the Wyoming darkness settled over the valley like it had been doing for years. Patient and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the plans of the people huddled against it. 3 days passed. They were not quiet days. There was work to do, always. But they were days without incident, and that absence of incident was its own kind of tension. Silas ran short trap lines and kept his eyes on the horizon. Eleanor strung wire through the aspen thicket in 2 concentric arcs, hanging tin pieces salvaged from old cans at intervals that would produce noise without wind triggering them. She also moved her bedroll permanently to the position near the east window, which she didn't explain and didn't need to. On the 4th night, at roughly 2 in the morning, the first of the wire lines rang. Silas was already awake. He heard it clearly. A single metallic note, brief and sharp, from the northwest edge of the aspen thicket. Then silence. Then, after about 30 seconds, the second line rang, further south. Something moving through the trees, big enough to pull the wire, careful enough to have paused between contact. Not an animal. Animals don't pause and recalculate. He was across the room in 4 steps, hand on Eleanor's shoulder. She was awake before he touched her, already sitting up, already reaching for the Winchester. How many? She breathed. Don't know yet. She moved to the east window in a crouch. He went to the west shutter, found the gap they'd left deliberately, narrow, enough to see through, and put his eye to it. Darkness and snow and the black shapes of the aspens about 200 yards out. Nothing moving. The horses in the corral were uneasy. He could hear the restless shifting of hooves, but not in full alarm, which meant whatever was out there was approaching slowly and from upwind. He counted the sounds he wasn't hearing. No voices, no horse sounds from outside the corral. On foot, then. He moved to the rifle rack, took down his own Winchester and the spare, checked both loads. Then the first shot came through the north wall. It hit the log above the fireplace with a sound like a hammer on wood, a heavy, flat crack, followed immediately by 2 more from different angles. Not pistol fire. Rifles, minimum 2, probably 3 separate positions. They'd bracketed the cabin from the north and west. Silas dropped below the window line. You hurt? No. Eleanor's voice came from the floor near the east window, completely steady. 3 rifles. I make it. Could be more. Stay down. I know to stay down. 2 more shots hit the north wall in quick succession, and then a voice called from the darkness outside, carrying clearly in the night air. A flat, professional voice, the voice of a man doing a job he's done before. Kane! Silas Kane! We don't need a fight here. Send the woman out and we walk away." Silas and Eleanor looked at each other across the dark room. "How many do you count?" he said quietly. "2 positions north, 1 west." She paused, but that voice came from directly in front. "South approach, near the corral." "4 then, at minimum." "Kane!" The voice again. "Hart woman has a price on her head. That's not our business with you. You send her out, this is finished." Silas didn't answer. He was thinking fast, the way he'd been trained to think. Not about what he felt, which was a cold, focused anger, but about geometry. 4 men, positioned to cover the north, west, and south approaches. The east was the ridge, steep and hard in the dark, which was why nobody was covering it. They'd assumed nobody would use it. They were wrong about that. He crawled to Eleanor. "I'm going out." Her head turned sharply. "Out. Through the east window, up the ridge. I can come around on their north position through the timber without them seeing me." She stared at him in the darkness for a moment. "That's a 1/4 mile in the dark through terrain you haven't walked in 2 years. I've walked it 10,000 times before that." He checked his rifle one more time. "You keep them focused on the cabin. Don't fire unless you have a shot. Don't waste ammunition." "I know how to manage ammunition." "I know you do." He touched her arm briefly, a contact so quick and practical it barely registered as anything other than emphasis. "Don't let them move the south man closer. The corral is cover for us, not for them. If he gets to the corral fence, I'll handle the south man," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the dark. Her face was a pale shape, and her eyes were very clear. "Back in 40 minutes, he said. He went out the east window into the black cold. The ridge behind the cabin rose steeply for about 60 feet before it leveled into a shelf of rock and sparse timber running north. Silas went up it fast and ugly, hands and feet both, his rifle slung across his back, the frozen rock biting through his gloves. A second burst of shots came from the north side of the cabin below him. 3 rounds, spaced, probing. And he heard Eleanor return 1 shot from the window, controlled and deliberate. "Good. Keep them looking at the light." He reached the shelf and moved north through the timber, pushing through snow that came to his knees in the drifted areas, staying in the shadows of the rock face, going by feel and memory and the map he'd been rebuilding in his head since he'd walked that perimeter 4 days ago. The cold at this elevation was sharp enough to make his eyes water, and the wind off the ridge worked at every gap in his coat, but he'd been cold for the better part of 2 years and his body had made a certain peace with it. He counted his paces. At 200 north, he cut west, dropping off the rock shelf into the timber on the slope above the aspen thicket. Below him, another exchange of fire from the cabin. Eleanor again, 1 shot, and then a shout from somewhere in the aspens, a man's voice, short and sharp. She'd hit something. Not necessarily the man, maybe his cover. But the shout meant the north position knew they were being shot at accurately. An accurate return fire from a defended position was exactly the kind of thing that made hired men recalculate the terms of their employment. Silas moved down through the timber. He found the first man at roughly the position he'd expected, behind a deadfall at the northern edge of the aspen thicket, lying in a shallow pit he'd dug in the snow to give himself a firing platform. A rifle, a pack, 2 extra boxes of cartridges laid out within reach. This was not a casual ambush. Someone had planned this. Silas came out of the dark to the man's left at a distance of about 15 feet and said quietly, "Don't." The man froze. "Put the rifle in the snow, hands where I can see them." A long pause. Silas watched the man's shoulders, the specific quality of tension in them, the calculation happening underneath. Then the rifle went down. "Who sent you?" Silas said. Silence. Silas stepped closer. "I'm going to ask you that once more, and you're going to think about the fact that you're lying in a hole in the snow on someone else's property at 2 in the morning, your partner just got shot at from inside that cabin, and I'm standing behind you with a rifle." A beat. "Who sent you?" "Hired work," the man said. His voice was young, younger than Silas had expected, 25 maybe. "We were hired through a man in Cheyenne. I don't know his real name." "What were your instructions?" "Take the woman. Alive." A pause. "Whatever it took." "And Kane?" Silence. "And Kane," Silas repeated. "Discretion," the man said. The word landed like a stone. Silas looked at the back of the man's head for a moment. He thought about Roy Kastner, who'd had a second well going in and no family in Missouri and hadn't been seen since spring. He thought about the word discretion and what it meant when men used it to mean the kind of thing that left no record. "Get up," he said. "Slowly. Leave the rifle." He walked the man back through the aspen thicket, hands bound with his own belt, and left him tied to a tree at the eastern edge of the thicket, with his ankles hobbled by a length of wire pulled from Eleanor's line. Not comfortable. Not dangerous, as long as the temperature didn't drop further, which it likely would. But that was a problem the man's employers had created, not Silas. He found the second man faster. The position had shifted after Eleanor's shot, which told him the shot had been close enough to unsettle the man's nerve. He was moving north through the aspens when Silas stepped out of the timber above him. This one didn't argue. Middle-aged, heavy-set, the expression of someone who'd already been doing a private accounting of risk versus pay and had reached an unfavorable conclusion. He put his hands up before Silas said a word. "West position," Silas said. "How many men total?" "4. Me, Danny, 2 out front." The man's breath came in short white clouds. "Leaders out front, by your corral." "Is the other front man still at his position?" A pause. "The woman shot him," the heavy-set man said. "In the arm. He's not going to be shooting back." Silas processed this without expression. He secured the second man, wrist to a different tree, close enough to the first man that they could hear each other but not reach each other, and moved south along the tree line toward the corral. He heard the leader before he saw him, which was the man's mistake. He was talking, low and urgent, into the dark near the south fence of the corral, the stream of a man who'd lost control of a situation and was trying to talk it back. "Doesn't matter, we reposition and wait for first light, we can—" He was talking to the wounded man who was sitting against the fence post with his left arm held tight to his body. Silas came out of the dark at the edge of the corral and put his rifle on the leader. The leader was a tall man, wide-shouldered, with the kind of weathered competence in his face that said he'd been doing this kind of work for a long time. He went very still when he saw Silas. The professional assessment happened in about 1 second. Silas could see it, the rapid scan, the calculation, the conclusion. His hands came away from his rifle. "The woman," he said. His voice was the same flat professional tone from before, but something had gone out of it. The authority had gone out of it. "Heart woman. The bounty on her is significant. Split it with you, you walk away tonight." "That's your offer," Silas said. "That's a good offer." "Whose bounty?" A pause. "You know whose." "Say the name." The leader looked at him steadily. "Aldrich Hart, out of Philadelphia. He's offering $1,200 for her return." Another pause. "And the same again for proof she won't be a problem." Silas felt the anger move through him cleanly, without heat, the way it did when it had fully settled into something past emotion and into decision. "Here's my offer," he said. "You pick up your wounded man and you walk north. You find your 2 colleagues tied up in the aspen thicket and you untie them, and all 4 of you keep walking until you're out of this valley. You don't stop in Dunmore. You go back to Cheyenne and you tell whoever hired you that this job is done. Not completed, done. And if anyone comes back here again, I will not be having conversations." The leader's jaw worked. "You just let us walk," he said. The skepticism in his voice was genuine. "I don't want to bury 4 men in the spring thaw," Silas said. "It's a lot of work, and the ground is still frozen." A long silence. The wounded man against the fence post made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, and the leader looked at him, then back at Silas. Then he reached down and put his arm under the wounded man's shoulder and hauled him upright. "Move north," the leader said, and whether he was talking to the wounded man or to himself or to the situation wasn't entirely clear. They moved north. Silas watched until the dark swallowed them, then watched for another 5 minutes to make sure the direction didn't change. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Eleanor met him at the door. She had the Winchester in her right hand and a lamp in her left, and she held the lamp up and looked at him the way people look at someone they've been waiting to see come back through a door, which is different from just looking at someone and is harder to hold without feeling something about. "4?" she said. "4. They're walking north. The South man took a bullet. His arm! He's not dead." She said it without apology, but with a slight stiffness, The residue of the decision and its weight. I had the shot. You made the right call. She lowered the lamp. She looked out past him at the dark valley, at the aspen thicket and the snow and the absolute silence that had replaced the rifle fire, and he could see her working through the accounting of it. What had happened, what had almost happened, what it meant going forward. Hart sent them, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let him inside, and she set the lamp on the table and the Winchester against the wall, and stood in the warm center of the cabin with her arms crossed and her chin slightly lowered in the way she held herself when she was thinking through something she didn't want to feel while she was thinking it. He knows where I am now, she said. Yes, these men will report back. Even if they don't give him this exact location, they'll tell him Wyoming Territory, Dunmore County. He has money enough to find out the rest. She looked at Silas. He won't send hired men a second time, not after this. Silas hung up his coat. His hands were finally starting to shake, slightly, the body doing what it does after the fact when it finally gets permission. He pressed them flat on the table for a moment. What will he send? He said. Eleanor's expression was very still. Himself, she said. Or someone close enough to himself that the result is the same. She pulled out a chair and sat down hard, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely tired in a way she wasn't managing. Not broken, nothing close to that, but the kind of stripped-down exhausted that comes when you've been fighting the same fight in different forms for long enough that you can feel the cumulative weight of all of it pressing down at once. I can't keep running ahead of him. I've been doing it for 2 years, and I am so tired of it. Then we stop running ahead of him, Silas said. She looked up. We've got Fenner, we've got the documents. We've got 7 cases of fraud that tie Harlan and Pruitt to a pattern that a territorial judge can't ignore. He sat down across from her. And whatever Aldrich Hart has done, whatever you know, whatever you left Philadelphia carrying, that's evidence too, if you're willing to use it. Her jaw tightened. It would have to come out, he said, carefully. I'm not going to tell you it wouldn't. I know. The things you left to escape. I know, Silas. What he did. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire was low, casting orange shapes across the cabin floor, and outside the valley was silent now, the kind of silence that follows violence and hasn't yet decided what it is. He had a business partner, Eleanor said finally, her voice very quiet and very even. A man named Colwell. They had a shipping enterprise together out of Philadelphia. 3 years ago, I found letters in Aldrich's study. She stopped. The letters described an arrangement that Colwell was threatening to expose, an arrangement involving falsified cargo manifests and a customs official who had been paid to look the other way for 3 years. She looked at the fire. Colwell died in a carriage accident 6 weeks after I found those letters. The accident was investigated and closed as accidental. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. I don't know for certain. I will never know for certain, but I know what I believe. The fire crackled. I took copies of 2 of those letters when I left, she said. They're in the saddlebag. I've been carrying them for 2 years because I didn't know what to do with them, and I was afraid to use them, and I was afraid to destroy them. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You've been carrying the reason he wants you silenced, he said. Yes. And the means to stop him. She met his eyes. If I can get them in front of the right people before he gets to me. Fenner's letter went to Judge Pryor 4 days ago, Silas said. Pryor will respond. When he does, we'll have a territorial judge in this county with the authority to convene a proper legal proceeding, and whatever gets submitted to that proceeding becomes part of the official record. He paused. Official records are very hard to make disappear. Eleanor stared at him. Something moved through her face. Not hope, exactly, because hope was too fragile a word for what she'd learned to carry. But something in that neighborhood. Something that had been waiting for a long time to have somewhere to stand. You think it would hold, she said. I think a federal customs fraud case attached to Aldrich Hart's name would make him considerably less interested in coming to Wyoming Territory, Silas said. I think a man who's been paying officials to look the other way spends a great deal of energy managing his exposure, and exposure is the one thing he cannot afford. Eleanor looked at the saddlebag hanging on its peg by the door. 2 years of carrying it. 2 years of moving it from boarding house to wagon to saddlebag to the floor of a Wyoming cabin, always knowing what was inside. always calculating the cost of using it and the cost of not using it. She stood up, crossed to the peg, unlatched the saddlebag and reached inside. She set 2 folded letters on the table alongside everything else. "Then we use everything," she said. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. There wasn't a formal decision made about it. No conversation where one of them said we should stay up and the other agreed. It was more that the night simply continued, the fire burning lower and then being fed again, the 2 of them sitting at the table with the documents spread between them and the lamps turned down to save oil. And neither of them moved toward sleep because sleep felt like something that belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. Eleanor sorted the letters from Aldrich's study with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She'd read them so many times over 2 years that the paper had softened at the folds. The ink slightly faded where she'd handled them most. She laid them flat on the table and explained each one to Silas in a quiet, even voice. The names, the dates, the specific language that described payments and arrangements in the careful oblique vocabulary of men who knew what they were doing was wrong and were trying to say it without quite saying it. Silas listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions when she finished, both practical: the name of the customs official and whether the shipping routes mentioned in the letters were domestic or international. "Domestic," Eleanor said. "Philadelphia to Baltimore, primarily. Some to Charleston." She paused. "The customs official's name is Garrett, Lawrence Garrett. He was still in the position when I left." "If he's still in the position, he's still exposed," Silas said. "And a man who's exposed is a man who might decide that cooperating with a federal inquiry is better than being the only one who goes down when the whole thing unravels." He looked at the letters. "These go to the federal marshal's office, not a county judge. This is above Pryor's jurisdiction." "I know." Eleanor folded the letters carefully and set them aside. "But if Pryor's proceeding against Harlan opens first, it creates official record. Official record draws attention, federal attention eventually." She looked at Silas. "The goal isn't to win a single case. The goal is to make Aldrich Hart radioactive enough that coming after me is more dangerous to him than letting me go." Silas thought about that for a moment. "That's a cold way to think about it," he said. "It's the only way that works." She said it without bitterness, which was almost worse. Just the flat accuracy of someone who had spent 2 years studying the specific mechanics of how powerful men protected themselves and had learned to think in the same geometry. "I don't have sentiment available for this. Sentiment is what he counted on when I didn't use these letters 2 years ago." He didn't argue with that. What he thought about, in the hours before dawn, was the leader of the hired men saying $1,200 with the practiced neutrality of someone quoting a market price. $1,200 for her return. The same again for proof she won't be a problem. He thought about that, and about Roy Kastner's empty homestead, and the word discretion, and he thought about Eleanor carrying those letters for 2 years across half a continent and all of this winter. And something settled in him that had been moving around loose since the night he'd come through his own front door to find a stranger pointing a rifle at him. He was not a man who made speeches about things. He'd never found the words for most of what he thought or felt, and he'd spent enough years alone that the habit of keeping things internal had calcified into something close to permanent. But sitting in the lamp-quiet cabin in the last hours before dawn, with the whole weight of what was coming pressing down on both of them, he found himself saying something that wasn't a speech, but was as close as he got. "Whatever happens in Dunmore," he said, "you're not handling it alone." Eleanor looked at him across the table. She was tired, genuinely, visibly tired in the deep way she almost never showed, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated enough that he couldn't read all of it. "I know," she said. It wasn't a big thing, 2 words, but the way she said it, not reflexively, not dismissively, but with actual weight, like she was accepting something she'd been holding at arm's length for a long time, told him it was not a small thing to her. They left it at that. Judge Wallace Pryor's reply to Fenner's letter arrived in Dunmore 12 days later, on the 15th of March. Mabel sent word by the hand of a young man named Tomas, who rode the 22 miles to the cabin in a single day on a horse that made it clear it resented the urgency. The message was short, written in Mabel's handwriting on a folded piece of paper. "Pryor is coming. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Stay where you are and don't do anything loud until he gets here." Silas read it twice and handed it to Eleanor. She read it once and said, 3 weeks. Maybe 4. She folded the paper and set it down. Outside, the March thaw was doing its intermittent work. Days above freezing now, the snowpack shrinking back from the south-facing slopes, the creek running clear where the ice had broken up. The valley was starting to look like it might eventually become something other than winter, which was a thing the valley did every year and which never quite stopped feeling like a minor event worth noticing. Harlan will hear Pryor is coming, Eleanor said. Almost certainly. Which means he has 3 weeks to do something about it before a territorial judge arrives with jurisdiction he can't buy. Yes. She stood at the window looking out at the valley. Her profile was sharp in the afternoon light. The strong jaw, the straight line of her nose, the particular set of her mouth that meant she was running through scenarios. He has 2 options. He destroys the evidence or he removes the witnesses. Fenner's copies are in the county record office under Hugh Fenner's personal supervision, Silas said. Good luck destroying those without Hugh noticing and making enough noise to be heard in Laramie. Which leaves the witnesses. She turned from the window. We need to go back to Dunmore. He'd been expecting that. Had been thinking about it himself for the last 2 days without quite saying it. The cabin was defensible but isolated. 22 miles from any help, one approach in winter, and Harlan now had reason to believe that direct force on the property was manageable if applied with enough men. Dunmore was a public place. Witnesses. A telegraph that ran to Laramie. Mabel's boarding house, which was the kind of establishment that people noticed when things happened around it. And Fenner was in Dunmore, alone, with the evidence. Tomorrow morning, Silas said. They packed the same evening. Eleanor took everything from the saddlebag out and repacked it with the documents in a specific order she'd worked out. Originals wrapped in oilskin in the center, copies in a separate oilskin sleeve around the outside, the 2 letters from Aldrich's study in the innermost layer with an additional wrap of canvas. She was methodical and unhurried about it, the way she was about anything she intended to have right. Silas watched her for a moment and then went to pack his own things, which took considerably less time because he owned considerably less. Silas, she said without looking up from the packing. Yeah, if Harlan moves against us in Dunmore, if there's a legal challenge, an injunction, something that ties things up before Pryor gets here. She paused, smoothing the canvas wrap. I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify to everything. The purchase, the deed, the forged documents, all of it. She paused again. And what I know about Aldrich. He looked at her back, at the particular tension in her shoulders that meant this was costing her something. You don't have to decide that now, he said. I already decided. I'm telling you so you know. She tucked the final layer of the saddlebag and latched it. I want us working from the same information. All right, he said. She finally looked over her shoulder at him. Her expression was clear and a little raw around the edges, the way people look when they've made a decision that closes a door that was the last exit from a difficult situation. All right, she agreed and turned back to the packing. They rode into Dunmore the following afternoon to find that Harlan had not waited. The first sign was the sheriff's deputy posted outside the county records office. A young man Silas didn't recognize, sitting on a chair that had been dragged onto the porch, with a rifle across his knees and the particular expression of someone who'd been told to be there and hadn't been told exactly why. Silas pulled up short half a block away. That's not Hugh's doing, Eleanor said quietly beside him. No. He scanned the street. The bank had 2 men standing near its front entrance, not inside, outside, which was unusual. Pruitt's land office, 3 buildings down from the bank, had its shutters closed, which was more unusual given that it was mid-afternoon on a weekday. And Mabel's boarding house at the north end of the street had a lamp burning in the upstairs window in the arrangement they'd agreed on. 1 lamp centered in the window meant trouble. 2 lamps meant come inside quickly. 1 lamp. Mabel's, Eleanor said. They came around to the boarding house from the back alley, left the horses in Mabel's small rear yard, and went in through the kitchen door. Mabel was there waiting, and with her was Hugh Fenner, who looked considerably less composed than the last time Silas had seen him, and had what appeared to be the beginnings of a bruise along his left jaw. What happened? Silas said. Harlan's men came to the records office this morning, Fenner said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. 2 of them. They had a writ. I don't know who signed it. It looked official enough on the surface. claiming the county records required auditing under Harlan's authority as a major county taxpayer. He touched his jaw. I told them that was not how county records authority worked. One of them was persuasive about disagreeing. They got inside? Eleanor asked. They got inside the front room. Fenner looked at her. They did not get into the inner storage room where the primary ledgers are kept, because I had barred that door from the inside before they arrived. I had time. One of Mabel's kitchen boys saw them coming from the bank and ran ahead. He paused. They spent approximately 30 minutes making a great deal of noise in the outer room. I imagine they found the working files I left on the table, which were copies of nothing important. The originals? Silas said. Fenner reached inside his coat and produced a flat oilskin packet. On my person since 6 this morning. Eleanor made a sound that might have been relief, or might have been something more tired than that. Mabel poured coffee for everyone and set it on the table with the directness of a woman who understood that what was needed in most crises was something hot to hold. Harlan called a meeting last night, she said, sitting down. I heard about it this morning. Several of the county councilmen, the sheriff, Pruitt. 2 hours in Harlan's bank office. She looked at Silas. Word is he's moving to have a county injunction filed against the property dispute before Pryor arrives. He's claiming the deed transfer to the Hart woman was legal, and your claim has been abandoned through non-occupancy. Non-occupancy, Eleanor said, the words flat and sharp. 2 years of trapping in the high basin is not non-occupancy under territorial law, Silas said. A man can be absent from his property for work purposes without forfeiting his claim. Harlan knows that, Fenner said. The injunction won't hold once Pryor reviews it, but it doesn't need to hold. It just needs to create confusion and competing claims that make it look, to an outside observer, like a genuine dispute rather than outright fraud. He set his coffee down. He's trying to muddy the picture before Pryor arrives. Then we clarify the picture, Eleanor said. She opened her saddlebag on the table. What followed was 3 hours of work that felt, at the time, both urgent and strangely quiet. The 4 of them at Mabel's kitchen table, organizing and cross-referencing documents with a focus that required them all to set aside the larger anxiety and occupy themselves with the immediate specific task of making the truth impossible to confuse with anything else. Fenner's ledger entries, Eleanor's purchase documents, the forged abandonment notice, the 7 additional cases Fenner had documented, each piece given its proper place in a chronological record that told a story clear enough that a judge who had no particular stake in the outcome would have no difficulty following it. The 2 letters from Aldrich's study sat at the edge of the table, slightly apart from the other documents. Fenner noticed them, but didn't ask. Eleanor didn't offer, not yet. We need the sheriff, Silas said, around the 2nd hour. Not to act against Harlan yet, just to know what's in these documents before Harlan can get to him further. Tom Breckett has been sheriff here for 11 years, Mabel said carefully. He's not corrupt. He's cautious. There's a difference. She paused. He knows something's wrong. He's known it for a while. He just hasn't had the kind of evidence that makes action feel safer than inaction. Then we give him that evidence, Eleanor said. He'll ask how you got it, Silas said, looking at her. I'll tell him I bought a piece of land with forged documents, and I've spent a winter in the wilderness figuring out what was done to me and by whom. She held Silas's gaze. That's the truth. It's enough. Breckett came to Mabel's back door at dusk, which told Silas that Mabel had sent word, and that whatever calculation the sheriff had been running had finally resolved itself. He was a thick-built man, late 40s, with an honest face gone tired around the eyes, in the way that 11 years of watching a small town from the inside and not always being able to fix what you saw would do to a face. He sat down at the table and looked at the documents for a long time. Nobody rushed him. When he finally looked up, he looked at Fenner first. You've had this. Parts of it, yes. Fenner touched the ledger. I was waiting for sufficient evidence to make action viable. I was also... He paused. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Breckett nodded once. Not a judgment, just an acknowledgement. He looked at Silas. You've been on the property since December. Since December 3rd. And you? He looked at Eleanor. Since May, she said. I arrived in May thinking I'd purchased a legal property from a licensed agent. I found out otherwise the day Silas came back. She met the sheriff's eyes. I have the full purchase record. the original correspondence with Pruitt, and documentation of the forged county seal. Fenner has verified the forgery against original records. Beckett looked at the stack of documents, then at the window, then back at the documents. Harlan filed the injunction paperwork this afternoon, he said, with Judge Coles, who is... He stopped. Who is in Harlan's pocket? Eleanor said. Beckett's expression tightened. Who has historically found in Harlan's favor on disputed matters, he said carefully. The injunction will be on paper by morning. Can you delay it? Silas asked. On what grounds? Competing evidence of fraud in the underlying transaction, Eleanor said immediately. If the original transfer was fraudulent, any legal proceeding based on that transfer is premature pending investigation. That's a procedural argument, not a substantive one. You don't have to prove the fraud tonight. You just have to create enough procedural question to pause the injunction until Pryor arrives. Beckett looked at her with an expression Silas recognized, the same expression he himself had worn in the early weeks. The recalibration, the adjusting of assumptions. You know law, the sheriff said. I know how men like Harlan use it, Eleanor said, which is close enough. Beckett was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the top document, the forged abandonment notice, and held it under the lamp. He looked at the seal, looked at the signature, looked at the comparison signature Fenner had paper-clipped alongside it from the original 1872 record. He set it down. I'll file a procedural challenge tonight, he said. Coles won't like it. Harlan definitely won't like it. He paused. And in the morning, I'm going to pay a visit to Gerald Pruitt. He'll deny everything, Silas said. Probably. Beckett's voice had changed. Still careful, but with something harder underneath it, the sound of a man who'd been cautious long enough and was deciding that caution had its limits. But I'd like to see his face when I put these documents on his desk. Some things are worth knowing even when they don't prove anything on their own. He stood, looked at Eleanor one more time. You're staying at Mabel's? Yes. Don't go anywhere alone. He said it plainly, without drama. Until Pryor gets here, treat this town like it has eyes everywhere, because it does, and most of them report to the same person. He left through the back door. The kitchen was quiet. Well, Mabel said after a moment. Well, Eleanor agreed. Silas stood up and went to the window. The main street was lit by the lamp outside the hotel and a few business windows still burning. The bank was dark. Pruitt's office was dark. Normal evening to look at it. Nothing to indicate that underneath the ordinary surface of a small frontier town, a structure that had been built over 2 years out of fraud and forged documents and the kind of patient greed that wears a legitimate face, all of it was starting to shake. He felt Eleanor come to stand beside him. She didn't say anything, and he didn't either, for a minute. Then she said, quietly, Roy Kastner. Yeah. We still don't know what happened to him. No. He paused. But if Beckett puts Pruitt in a room with these documents, a man like Pruitt, not a hard man, an opportunistic man, the first thing he's going to do is try to save himself by talking about someone else. He looked at her. If there's something to know about Roy, Pruitt knows it. Eleanor looked at this dark street. Her reflection in the window glass was pale and clear and very still. And if what happened to Roy is what I think it is, then that goes into Pryor's proceeding too, Silas said. All of it. Harlan will try to run, she said. When it starts coming apart, men like him run. They have money, they have contacts, they have routes out. Maybe. Silas watched the empty street. But he can't run from federal fraud records. And he can't run from 7 families who lost their land and are still here. He paused. The Territorial Marshal's office in Laramie has a standing interest in land fraud cases since the Consolidated Land Act. Fenner's letter to Pryor would have triggered a copy to the Marshal as a matter of procedure. Eleanor turned to look at him. You knew that? Fenner mentioned it. He almost smiled. He is very meticulous. Something shifted in her expression. Relief and exhaustion and something warmer than either, threaded through with the particular look of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just, for the first time, felt the weight begin to distribute itself across more than one set of hands. She turned back to the window. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4. Pryor will come, Silas said, and when he does, we'll have everything waiting. The days that followed were tense, in the particular way that a situation is tense when the major events have been set in motion, and now everyone is waiting to see which ones arrive first. Brackett's procedural challenge slowed the injunction as he'd promised. Coles had sputtered and objected, but couldn't deny the procedural validity without creating an appealable record. And creating appealable records was the last thing anyone in Harlan's circle wanted just now. Pruitt, when Brackett visited him, did not confess. But he did. According to Brackett's account delivered to Mabel's kitchen table, go the color of old flour and say absolutely nothing for a full 90 seconds when the forged abandonment notice was placed in front of him. He asked for a lawyer. Brackett told him that was his right and left. 24 hours later, Pruitt was not in his office. His nephew Daniel was there, visibly distressed, and told the deputy who came to inquire that his uncle had ridden out the previous evening, saying he had business in the next county. He hadn't said when he'd be back. "He's running," Eleanor said when she heard. "He's scared," Silas said. "Running scared and no plan. That's almost better than having him here. A man that frightened talks to people, asks for help, leaves tracks." Mabel put coffee on and said, "He'll go to Harlan first. He's always gone to Harlan." She was right. They found out 2 days later through one of the reliable currents of information that small towns run on, Mabel knew someone who knew someone, that Pruitt had spent a night at the house of one of Harlan's associates south of town and had then ridden north toward the pass, which was either a retreat or a message delivery, and neither option was good for Harlan. Meanwhile, Silas and Eleanor waited and worked and did not let their guard down. He noticed things about her in those weeks in Dunmore that he hadn't had quite the same angle to see in the cabin. The way she talked to Mabel, not the carefully managed politeness she'd used at first, but something easier. Two women who'd found each other's level and were comfortable there. The way she spent an afternoon with the Abernethy family when they came into town, sitting with the wife for 2 hours, going through the woman's documents with her in the same organized way she'd gone through her own, and coming out of that meeting with 3 additional pieces of evidence for Fenner's record, and the particular expression of someone who has found that helping someone else with the same wound helps your own. He noticed the way she held herself in public versus private. In the street, measured and watchful, nothing wasted. In Mabel's kitchen, slightly different, the shoulders a fraction lower, the precision slightly softened. Not less herself. More herself, maybe. The version of herself that existed when the resources being spent on vigilance could be temporarily redirected somewhere else. She noticed things too. He was aware of being noticed, which was not a feeling he was practiced with. One evening, sitting on Mabel's porch in the cold with coffee going cold in their hands because neither of them had felt like going in yet, she said, "You're going to go back up." He looked at her. "What?" "To the high basin, next trapping season." She wasn't accusatory or sad about it, just stating what she'd concluded. "That's where you're comfortable." He thought about denying it and didn't. "I was going to. I'd planned on it." "And now?" He looked at the dark street for a while. "I don't know," he said. "I genuinely don't know." She nodded slowly. Not pushing. Not reading anything into it either way, or if she was, she kept it behind her eyes where it was hers. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're more comfortable with people than you believe you are. You just had to find ones that didn't require you to be something else." He held his coffee and didn't answer, and she let him not answer, and they sat on Mabel's cold porch until the lamps on the main street went out one by one, and the town settled into the particular silence of a place that is holding its breath. 26 days after Fenner's letter had gone to Laramie, a rider came down the main street of Dunmore at a canter and pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. He was carrying an official dispatch from the Wyoming Territorial Court. Judge Wallace Pryor would arrive in Dunmore in 3 days' time, with full jurisdiction to convene a formal evidentiary hearing in the matter of disputed land transactions and related fraud. Silas was in Mabel's kitchen when Brackett came to the back door with the news. He looked at Eleanor. She had the saddlebag on the table in front of her, had been reviewing the documents again, the way she did when she needed to feel certain that everything was in order. Her hand rested flat on the bag's surface. She looked back at him. 3 days. "We're ready," she said. Judge Wallace Pryor arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day to arrive and change everything about a place. He came in on the Laramie stage with 2 federal deputies and a court clerk carrying a box of blank ledger books. and he stepped down onto the muddy main street of Dunmore, looking like exactly what he was. A man in his late 50s who had seen enough frontier fraud cases to stop being surprised by them, but had not yet stopped being angry about them, which Silas considered the right combination. He was lean and gray-haired and walked with a slight hitch in his left knee that didn't slow him down, and he shook Brackett's hand at the sheriff's office door and went inside and did not come out for 2 hours. Silas and Eleanor waited at Mabel's. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold and didn't move for most of that 2 hours. Not anxious, exactly. She was past the kind of anxious that shows on the outside, but present in a specific way, like every part of her attention was gathered in one place and being held very still. Silas paced. He was not a pacer by nature, and he was aware that he was doing it, and he kept stopping and then starting again, which was worse. Mabel finally told him he was making her dizzy and handed him a piece of wood and a knife and told him to do something with his hands. He sat down and started carving nothing in particular and felt somewhat better. "You're nervous," Eleanor said, without looking up from her cold coffee. "I'm not nervous." "You carved a hole through that piece." He looked down. She was right. He set the wood down. "I want it to go right," he said. "I know." She finally looked up at him. "It'll go right because the evidence is right. We've done everything we can do." She paused. "The rest isn't in our hands." "I know that." "You know it," she said, "but knowing it and being comfortable with it are different things." He didn't argue. Brackett came to the back door at 4:30 and told them Pryor wanted to see them. Both of them. That evening, at the sheriff's office. The meeting lasted 3 hours and was one of the stranger experiences of Silas's life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quality of being heard by someone with the authority to act on what they were hearing. Pryor listened to everything. He read the documents with the unhurried attention of someone for whom the details mattered as much as the conclusion. He asked questions, sharp, specific questions that showed he'd understood the structure of the fraud quickly and was now probing for the places it might unravel under pressure. He asked Silas to describe the forged seal as he'd identified it that first night in the cabin. He asked Eleanor to walk him through every interaction with Pruitt, including what the clerk had witnessed and when. He spent a long time with Fenner's ledger, going back and forth between entries. Then he set everything down and looked at both of them. "In the 14 years I've been riding circuit in this territory," he said, "I've seen land fraud in most of its common forms. Forged deeds, manufactured debts, manipulated tax records." He tapped the stack of documents in front of him. "What you've brought me here is not common. This is organized. 7 properties, at minimum, over a period of at least 2 years, with a sitting bank president providing both financing and institutional cover." He paused. "This is going to take more than one hearing." "However long it takes," Eleanor said. Pryor looked at her. "You understand that you'll be required to testify in an open proceeding?" "Yes." "Harlan has a lawyer, a good one, apparently, out of Cheyenne. He will challenge your credibility, your motives for being here, everything about your account." "I know." Eleanor's voice was level. "I have 17 months of documented frontier experience, the original purchase records, and a forged county seal that Fenner can demonstrate was not produced by the county recorder's office." She met Pryor's eyes. "My credibility is in the documents. He can challenge my character all he wants." Pryor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is another matter." Eleanor reached into the saddlebag without being asked and placed the 2 letters from Aldrich's study on the table. Pryor looked at them, then at her. He didn't touch them yet. "Those fall outside my jurisdiction," he said. "I know. I'm asking you to tell me where they should go." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the first letter and read it. "Set it down. Read the second. Set that down too." His expression was that of a man who has just been handed a problem he didn't ask for and is deciding whether it's also an obligation. "The federal marshal's office in Laramie," he said. "Marshal Cade. He handles customs fraud matters that originate in the eastern districts." He paused. "If these letters are what they appear to be, the exposure they describe involves federal jurisdiction going back several years." "Will it reach Philadelphia?" Eleanor said. "If it's handled properly, yes." Pryor folded his hands on the table. "Miss Hart, I want to be direct with you. The man who sent men to this territory to retrieve you, or worse, will not be easily touched. He has resources, connections, lawyers who know how to slow federal processes for years. He paused. But a man managing that kind of exposure does not do so comfortably, and an uncomfortable man makes mistakes. He looked at her. What I can tell you is that getting these letters into the federal record changes your position significantly. You become considerably more dangerous to him as a witness in an active federal inquiry than as a person who has simply disappeared. Eleanor absorbed this without visible reaction. That's what I needed to know, she said. Pryor wrote a letter of introduction to Marshal Cade that same evening and gave it to Eleanor along with a sealed copy of the two letters, signed as verified by a territorial court officer. It was a small thing in terms of paper and ink. It was not a small thing in terms of what it meant for a woman who had been running for 2 years from a man who counted on her having nowhere to stand. The formal hearings began 4 days later in the Dunmore Community Hall, which was the largest interior space in town, and which filled up on the first morning with more people than Silas had known lived in the county. Farmers, homesteaders, merchants, families whose names he half recognized and half didn't. People who had been watching Harlan run this valley for 8 years, and had developed the particular spectator's appetite that comes from watching something go wrong for a long time, and finally seeing the possibility that it might go right. Martin Harlan appeared on the first day with his Cheyenne lawyer, a man named Fitch, who had a courtroom manner like a well-dressed glacier, cold, slow, and designed to make everything in its path feel insurmountable. He objected to the evidence submission procedures. He objected to Fenner's standing as a witness. He argued that the court lacked jurisdiction over private banking arrangements. Pryor overruled each objection with the brevity of someone who had heard all of these arguments before and had decided views about them. Harlan himself sat very still throughout the first day, watching everything with the expression of a man doing long financial calculations in his head and not enjoying the results. Pruitt was not there. Pruitt had been found, eventually, at a farmstead 40 miles north, living under a different name with the unhappy expression of a man who had run out of road. Breckett had brought him back, and he sat in the hearing room on the second day with his hands folded, and his lawyer, a local man, not Fitch, notably less expensive, beside him. And when Pryor asked him directly about the abandonment notice, Pruitt looked at his hands for a long moment and then looked at Harlan. Harlan did not look back. That, more than anything, seemed to decide something for Gerald Pruitt. He talked for 2 hours, not because he was courageous. Courage had nothing to do with it. He talked because Harlan had just communicated, in the language of a man who doesn't look at the person he's finished using, that Gerald Pruitt was on his own. And a man who has been betting everything on someone else's protection and suddenly finds himself without it makes different calculations than he would have made the day before. What Pruitt said about Roy Kastner was the part of it that landed on the room like something physical. Roy hadn't gone back to Missouri. Roy had come to Pruitt in the fall of 1873, 6 months after his land had been sold, with documents of his own, records of the original purchase, a letter from the Territorial Land Office confirming his claim. Roy had put those documents on Pruitt's desk and told him he knew what had been done and was going to the sheriff. Pruitt had gone to Harlan. 2 weeks later, Roy Kastner had been found drowned in the Whetstone Creek, 4 miles from his old homestead. The inquest had returned a verdict of accidental death. The inquest had been conducted by a county coroner who, it emerged over the next 2 days of testimony, had been a beneficiary of 2 substantial loans from Dunmore Cattlemen's Bank, both at rates well below market. The community hall was very quiet when Pruitt finished saying that. Silas looked at the ceiling for a moment. He thought about the grave that was probably out there somewhere along the Whetstone, unmarked, and the cousin in Missouri who would never know where her family had gone. There was no clean feeling available for that information, no resolution, just the knowledge of it added to everything else, another weight in a pile that was already too heavy. He looked at Eleanor. She was looking straight ahead, her jaw set, her eyes dry and very clear. Not unmoved, the opposite of unmoved, just holding it because the room required someone to hold things, and she had been holding things for a long time. Harlan's lawyer made a vigorous attempt on the third day to have Pruitt's testimony dismissed as the self-serving account of a confessed co-conspirator. Pryor allowed the argument and then denied the motion with 4 sentences that essentially constituted a legal summary of why Fitch was wrong. The gallery, which had grown larger each day, people standing at the back when the chairs ran out, made a sound that wasn't quite anything but communicated clearly. Harlan fired Fitch at the lunch recess on the fourth day. The word moved through Dunmore in about 40 minutes. By the end of the fourth day, with the documentary evidence fully entered into the record and Fenner's testimony complete, 17 properties now, Fenner had found 3 more in a final review of his ledgers. The shape of what Harlan had done was fully visible in a way that nobody in that room could pretend not to see. The coroner who had signed Roy Kastner's death certificate was sitting in the gallery with the expression of a man who had made a series of choices and was now watching those choices arrange themselves into a formation pointed directly at him. Harlan was arrested on the morning of the 5th day, before the hearing resumed. Breckett did it himself. Silas watched from the street again. He hadn't planned to watch. He was on his way to the community hall, and Breckett came out of the bank with Harlan in front of him and 2 deputies behind. And the main street of Dunmore went quiet in the way that a street goes quiet when something people have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it finally happens. Harlan looked neither left nor right as he walked. His face was controlled. The face of a man who understood that expression was one of the last things he controlled and was not going to give that up. He was well-dressed, as always. His shoes were not appropriate for the mud. Silas watched him pass. He didn't feel the satisfaction he might have expected. He felt tired, mostly. The specific tiredness that comes after a long thing is done and the body finally gets the message that it can stop. He felt something about Roy Kastner that didn't have a name yet but would settle into grief eventually, the clean kind that comes when you know all the facts and can finally do the work of carrying them properly. He turned and walked to the community hall. The deed business was handled the following week, after Pryor had completed the formal record and issued his findings. The findings were thorough and specific, and, when read aloud in the community hall on the last morning, produced a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. 7 fraudulent transactions reversed. 3 additional transactions flagged for further review. The Dunmore Cattlemen's Bank placed under territorial receivership pending full audit. Gerald Pruitt facing criminal fraud charges with his cooperation noted for sentencing consideration. Martin Harlan facing criminal fraud, conspiracy, and accessory charges in connection with the death of Roy Kastner. The new deed for the property in the valley was issued with both names on it. It had been Pryor's suggestion, not Silas's. He'd noted in the dry procedural way he had that the property had been occupied and substantially improved by Eleanor Hart for 17 months prior to the resolution of the dispute, and that territorial homestead law recognized material contribution to a property's development as a basis for establishing claim. He could issue the deed in Silas's name alone, he said, or he could recognize the actual history of what had happened and issue it accordingly. He'd looked at Silas when he said it. Silas had said yes without hesitation, which surprised him slightly. The lack of hesitation, not the answer. The answer felt like the most obvious thing in the world. Eleanor said nothing for a moment when Pryor told her. Then she said very quietly, "You don't have to do that." "I know," Silas said. She looked at the document on the table between them. Her name beside his on the line, the official seal, the real one, not a forgery, pressed into the paper. "I fixed your chinking," she said. Her voice was a little unsteady, just at the edges. "And your roof." "You did." "And I found your spare horseshoes." "You did." "So," she pressed her lips together briefly, "I suppose it's fair." She picked up the pen and signed her name. They rode back to the valley 2 days later on an April morning that was genuinely warm for the first time, the kind of warmth that had actual staying power, the light coming through the trees at a lower angle, and the air carrying the smell of wet earth and snowmelt, and the particular green smell of things that had been waiting all winter and had now decided to proceed. Mabel had packed them food for 3 days, though the ride only took 2. She had also, without being asked, written a letter to Marshal Cade in Laramie herself, describing what she had witnessed in Dunmore over the past weeks, and gave a copy to Eleanor as additional supporting documentation. It was a thorough letter. Mabel's letters were always thorough. She stood on the porch of the boarding house when they rode out and watched them go with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough in a hard place to recognize when something had gone genuinely right, which was not a common enough occurrence to be casual about. Eleanor looked back once, and Mabel raised a hand, and that was enough. They didn't talk much on the ride. Not the early silence of two strangers forced together by circumstances. Not the careful, managed quiet of people working around each other. Something different. Something that had taken all winter and most of a spring to develop. The kind of quiet that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to discuss it constantly to know it happened. On the second afternoon, coming down out of the pass and into the upper end of the valley, Silas stopped his horse on the slope and sat for a moment. The valley looked the same as it always had. Snow still on the high ridges, aspens starting to bud out below the timberline, the creek running clear and fast with runoff. The cabin in the distance, smoke coming from the chimney. Mabel had arranged for a neighbor's boy to keep a fire going. And the corral and the lean-to and the split-rail fence that Eleanor had repaired in her first weeks there. He'd spent years in country that was beautiful and hadn't spent much time thinking about it as beautiful. It was just country. You worked it or it worked you. But sitting on the slope looking at the valley, he thought that it was, in fact, beautiful, and that it had been beautiful for a long time, and he'd been too busy surviving it to properly notice. Eleanor pulled up beside him. She looked at the valley for a moment, then she said, "You're still deciding." He looked at her. "Whether to go back up," she said. Not an accusation, just naming the thing that had been sitting between them since the conversation on Mabel's porch. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've been treating being alone as the thing I'm choosing, when actually I was just avoiding choosing something else." Eleanor was quiet. "That's not the same as knowing what to choose," he added, because he was not a man who tied things up neatly and wasn't going to start. "No," she agreed, "it's not." They sat on the slope in the afternoon light, the horses patient underneath them, the valley waiting below. "The letters went to Laramie," she said after a while. "Kate acknowledged receipt 2 days before we left. He's opening a preliminary inquiry." She paused. "It'll take time. Aldrich will fight it. But it's in the federal record now." A beat. "He can't make it disappear." "No," Silas said. "He can't." "So," she looked at the cabin, "I'm not running anymore." There was something about the way she said it. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, more the way someone sounds when they've put something down that they've been carrying so long. The absence of it feels almost strange, like she was still getting used to the shape of her own hands without the weight in them. He understood that feeling, actually. He'd been carrying his own version of it for years. The solitude, the distance, the careful architecture of a life built to need nothing and nobody. It had kept him functional. It had also kept him from most things worth having, and he was 34 years old and had only recently begun to reckon with that. "I'm not going back up," he said. Eleanor turned to look at him. "Not this fall," he said. "Maybe not next year either." He looked at the cabin, at the valley, at the deed in his coat pocket with both their names on it. "There's enough here." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's not a small thing for you." "No," he said. "It's not." She nodded. She looked at the valley again, and whatever was in her face in that moment, he didn't try to catalog it, he just let it be what it was. They rode down. The cabin was warm from the kept fire, and the stores were where they'd left them, and the things they'd built together over the winter. The additional shelving, the repaired lean-to roof, the wire line through the aspen thicket that they'd leave up because why wouldn't you? All of it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Eleanor set the saddlebag on its peg, the one that had carried the documents, the letters, the proof of everything. She'd send for the rest of her things from storage in Cheyenne when the roads were properly clear. There wasn't much. She'd traveled light for 2 years, but she'd said there were books, which she wanted. Silas started a fresh fire from what the neighbor's boy had left, and Eleanor took stock of the stores and started a list of what they'd need from Dunmore in the next few weeks. And outside the valley moved through its quiet spring business of becoming itself again after winter. It wasn't clean or resolved the way stories are supposed to be. Roy Kastner was still dead, and the grief of that was real and would be for a long time. The county had 7 families trying to rebuild what the fraud had taken from them, and some of them would manage it, and some of them probably wouldn't entirely. Harlan's trial would drag through the territorial courts for months, and Fitch would come back and argue every procedural point available, and some mornings would arrive with news that made progress feel like an illusion. And Aldrich Hart was still in Philadelphia, reading federal mail he couldn't make disappear, making calculations about exposure and risk, learning for perhaps the first time what it felt like to be the one who couldn't simply close a door. None of it was finished. Most things worth doing never fully finish. But the valley was theirs. Both their names on the deed, both their hands on the work that had already been done and the work still coming. A woman who had crossed a continent running from a life she hadn't chosen and had built, in the wilderness, a life she had. And a man who had spent years learning that loneliness was not the same as peace, and had been wrong about the difference between the two for long enough that being wrong about it had almost become a kind of identity. People are like that. They hold on to the versions of themselves that hurt least until something, or someone, makes holding on more expensive than letting go. Late that evening, after supper, Eleanor sat at her table with the books she kept there. Not the ledger, but a novel she'd been working through slowly since October, reading a chapter some nights when the work was done. Silas sat across the room and sharpened a knife he'd been meaning to sharpen for weeks, running the whetstone in the slow, rhythmic way that hands do when the work is familiar enough to be almost meditative. Neither of them said anything. The fire burned. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the valley the same way it always had and always would. Patient, immense, indifferent to the particular dramas of the small, warm things huddled against it. And inside, for the first time in a long time, neither of them was bracing against it. That was enough. That, as it turned out, was quite a lot.